I stood there in the living room I had helped him buy, looking at my 32-year-old son's face-to-face. I'd kissed goodnight for thousands of nights and heard words that would change everything between us forever. You can leave now. Not thanks for stopping by. Not, we'll talk later. Just a cold dismissal like I was some unwelcome stranger who'd overstayed their welcome. What he didn't know was that his mortgage, the one that made that dismissive moment possible, was still in my name. And the next morning, while he was probably sipping coffee in the kitchen I'd helped him afford, I was sitting across from a loan officer, signing papers that would pull that financial safety net right out from under him. But let me back up, because this story isn't really about revenge. It's about what happens when love becomes so twisted with enabling that you can't tell where helping ends and hurting begins. It's about a mother who spent 32 years trying to be everything to her son, only to realize she'd created someone who saw her as nothing. My name is Margaret, and I need to tell you about the day I stopped being a mother and started being a stranger in my own child's life, and what I did about it. To understand how we got to that moment, you need to know about the 4 years that led up to it. 4 years since my husband Robert died of a sudden heart attack, leaving me alone in a house that felt too big and too quiet. David had been 28 then, living in a cramped apartment across town, working as a junior marketing coordinator at a mid-sized firm. He'd been struggling financially, student loans, credit card debt, the kind of paycheck-to-paycheck existence that so many young adults face. When Robert died, David had been my lifeline. He'd helped with funeral arrangements, paperwork, insurance claims. He'd checked on me daily, sometimes staying overnight when the grief felt too heavy to bear alone. For months, we'd leaned on each other, two people trying to figure out how to exist in a world that suddenly felt unfamiliar. But somewhere in that grieving process, something had shifted. My daily check-ins with David became expected rather than appreciated. My offers to help with his financial struggles became assumptions that I should be involved in every major decision. What had started as mutual support during a crisis had slowly transformed into something that looked more like dependence, though I couldn't see it at the time. The house hunting had begun about 2 years after Robert's death. David had mentioned casually that his lease was coming up for renewal and that his rent was increasing again. "I feel like I'm just throwing money away," he'd said over dinner at my place. "I'd love to buy something, but with my credit and income ... That's when I'd made the offer that would later haunt both of us. "What if I co-signed?" I'd suggested. "We could look at some places together. Find something that fits your budget, but would accept an application with my income backing it up." His face had lit up in a way I hadn't seen since before his father died. "Really? You do that?" "Of course, honey. It's an investment in your future." Looking back now, I can see all the warning signs I missed. The way he'd immediately deferred to my opinion about neighborhoods. How he'd let me take the lead in conversations with real estate agents. The subtle shift in his posture during house tours, less engaged, more passive, like he was watching me choose his life for him. But at the time, I told myself I was being helpful. I had the financial stability, the good credit, the experience of home ownership. It made sense for me to guide the process. What I didn't realize was that by making myself indispensable, I was making him dependent. The colonial-style house with the wraparound porch had been my choice. No, David had agreed enthusiastically. It was more expensive than what he could have afforded alone, but with my co-signature, the bank had approved a mortgage that stretched his budget to its limits. I'd convinced myself that it was an investment in his future, that he'd grow into the payments as his career advanced. What I hadn't considered was how those payments would create an ongoing financial relationship between us that gave me an excuse to stay involved in every aspect of his life. "How are you managing the mortgage this month?" became a regular question during our phone calls. When he mentioned being a little tight on money, I'd offered to cover utilities or groceries. When the house needed repairs, I'd insist on paying for them since I was invested in the property. Each financial contribution came with opinions about how he should manage his money, suggestions about his career choices, advice about everything from his diet to his dating life. And David, perhaps feeling obligated because of my help, had tolerated it all with increasing resentment that I was too absorbed in my own helpfulness to notice. The breaking point had been building for months before that awful conversation in his living room. There had been smaller incidents, moments when I'd caught glimpses of his frustration, but had dismissed them as temporary stress, like the time I'd let myself into his house with the spare key he'd given me for emergencies, intending to surprise him by cleaning and stocking his refrigerator while he was at work. I'd spent hours scrubbing floors, organizing closets, filling his pantry with groceries I thought he needed. When he'd come home and found me there, his reaction hadn't been gratitude but barely controlled anger. "Mom, you can't just come into my house when I'm not here," he'd said, his voice tight. "I was helping," I'd protested. "I thought you'd be happy to come home to a clean house and a full refrigerator, but I didn't ask for help, and I didn't invite you over. I don't need an invitation to help my son." The look on his face had been something I should have paid more attention to, a mixture of frustration and resignation that suggested this conversation had been a long time coming. Or the incident with Sarah, the woman he'd been dating for several months. I'd known he was serious about her because he'd mentioned her name more than once during our calls, which was unusual for David. He typically kept his dating life private. When he'd finally invited her to a family barbecue at my house, I'd been determined to make a good impression. But somewhere in my enthusiasm to welcome her, I'd crossed lines I didn't even realize existed. I'd asked pointed questions about her career ambitions, made comments about how young she looked, suggested that David deserved someone who was more established in life. I'd convinced myself I was being protective, looking out for his best interests. Sarah had been polite throughout the evening, but I'd noticed her growing quieter as the night went on. She'd left early, citing an early morning meeting. David had been unusually quiet after she'd gone, and they'd broken up 2 weeks later. What happened with Sarah? I'd asked when he'd mentioned they were no longer seeing each other. "It just didn't work out," he'd said, but his tone had been clipped in a way that suggested there was more to the story. "She seemed nice, but maybe a little young for you. You probably want someone more mature, more settled." "Mom, please don't." "Don't what?" "I'm just saying, don't analyze my relationships. Don't tell me what I want. Don't make it seem like you know better than I do about my own life." I'd been hurt by his reaction, had told myself he was just disappointed about the breakup and taking it out on me. I hadn't considered that my behavior during that barbecue might have contributed to the relationship's end. These incidents had been accumulating like small tears in the fabric of our relationship, but I'd been so focused on my intentions, which were always loving, always meant to help, that I'd ignored the impact of my actions. The day everything fell apart had started innocently enough. I'd spent the morning making David's favorite chili, the recipe his father had loved, adding extra vegetables because I worried he wasn't eating healthy enough. I'd stopped at the grocery store and picked up the crackers he liked, some fruit that was on sale, a few other items I thought he might need. Driving to his house, I'd felt the familiar warmth of anticipation that came with these surprise visits. I'd imagined his smile when he saw the chili, his gratitude for the groceries, maybe an invitation to stay for dinner so we could catch up properly. It had been 3 weeks since we'd spent any real time together, and I'd been feeling the distance like a physical ache. But when David had answered the door that afternoon, something had been different. His posture was rigid, his expression guarded. He'd looked at me standing there with my container of chili and bag of groceries like I was a problem he'd been hoping to avoid. "Hi, honey," I'd said, trying to keep my voice light despite the chill in his greeting. "I brought you some chili, and I picked up those crackers you like from the store." Instead of stepping aside to let me in, he'd remained in the doorway, effectively blocking my entrance. "I didn't ask you to bring anything." The words had hit me like a physical blow. Not thank you. Not come in. Just a flat rejection of the gesture I'd thought would bring us together. "I know, but I was making a big batch anyway, and I thought, that's the problem," he'd interrupted. And his voice had carried a weight of accumulated frustration. You think you know what I need. You think you know when to show up. You think you can just insert yourself into my life whenever you want." I'd felt my stomach drop, but I tried to stay calm. "David, I'm your mother. I thought you'd be happy to see me." He'd finally stepped back then, but not in welcome, more like he was creating physical distance between us. "Come in, but we need to talk." Following him into the living room, I'd noticed changes since my last visit. The space had felt different, more sparse. The family photos that had once lined the mantel were gone. The throw pillows I'd given him as a housewarming gift were nowhere to be seen. It was as if he'd been systematically removing traces of our shared history from his space. "Sit down," he'd said, but his tone had made it sound less like an invitation and more like an order. I'd perched on the edge of the couch, setting the chili and groceries on the coffee table, my hands folded in my lap. David had remained standing, pacing slightly in front of the fireplace, his movements agitated and restless. The silence that stretched between us had felt alive, pulsing with unspoken tensions. I'd waited, hoping he would say something that would explain his cold reception, something that would give me a chance to fix whatever was wrong. "I need you to stop," he'd said finally, his back to me as he stared at the empty mantel. "Stop what?" I'd asked, though part of me already knew the answer would hurt. He turned to face me then, and the expression on his face was one I'd never seen before, a mixture of exhaustion and determination that made him look older than his 32 years. All of it. The unexpected visits, the constant phone calls, the groceries I didn't ask for, the advice I don't want. "I need space, Mom. I need you to back off." The room had felt like it was tilting around me. "I don't understand. I'm just trying to help, I know. You're always trying to help, but you're suffocating me." His voice had started to rise, years of suppressed frustration finally finding their way to the surface. "I'm 32 years old, and I feel like I can't make a decision without you hovering over me. Can't have a relationship without you analyzing it. Can't live my own life without you trying to fix things that aren't broken." Each word had felt like a separate wound. "When have I ever interfered with your relationships?" "Sarah," he'd said immediately, and the speed of his response suggested he'd been waiting for this conversation for a long time. "You remember Sarah, right? The woman I was seeing last year? Every time she came over, you just happened to drop by. You'd make these little comments about her clothes, her job, the way she laughed too loudly. You drove her away. I was just being friendly. You were being judgmental and possessive. And when she finally told me she couldn't handle the way you treated her, when she said she felt like she was dating both of us, you acted like it was her fault for not appreciating family values." I'd opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain that I'd only been trying to get to know someone who was important to him, but the words had died in my throat, because somewhere in the back of my mind, I'd known he wasn't entirely wrong. I had made those comments about Sarah. I had shown up unannounced when she was visiting. I had asked probing questions that went beyond normal motherly interest. "And it's not just relationships," David had continued, his voice gaining strength as he'd finally been able to voice complaints that had clearly been building for years. "It's everything. My job, my finances, my house, my schedule, what I eat, how I spend my free time. You act like you have a say in all of it." "But I helped you buy this house," I'd said quietly, gesturing around the living room. "I co-signed the mortgage because I wanted to help you get started in life." His expression had hardened then, his jaw setting in a way that reminded me painfully of his father when Robert was preparing for a difficult conversation. "And there it is," David had said, his voice quiet but cutting. "You helped me, so you think you own me. You think because you co-signed a piece of paper, you get to have opinions about everything I do in here. That's not what I meant, isn't it?" He'd stopped pacing and looked directly at me, his eyes holding mine in a way that made it impossible to look away. "Because every time we have a disagreement, every time I try to set any kind of boundary, you find a way to remind me about all the things you've done for me. The down payment help, the co-signing, the furniture you bought when I couldn't afford to furnish the place, the groceries you bring every week, the repairs you've paid for. It's like you're keeping a running tab of everything you've done, and you expect gratitude and compliance in return." The accusation had hit me like a physical blow because there was truth in it that I'd never wanted to acknowledge. I had reminded him of my help during past disagreements. I had used my financial contributions as justification for having opinions about his choices. "I've never kept score," I protested weakly. "I've done those things because I love you." "No," he'd said, and his voice had been quieter now but somehow more devastating. You've done those things because you're afraid of being alone. Dad died, and instead of learning to live your own life, you decided to live mine instead. The words had hung in the air between us like a physical presence. I'd wanted to argue, to defend myself, to explain that everything I'd done had been motivated by genuine love and concern for his well-being. But sitting there in that living room, surrounded by the evidence of my financial investment in his life, I'd begun to wonder if he was right. Had I been using my help as a way to maintain relevance in his life? Had I been so afraid of losing the only family I'd left that I'd tried to make myself indispensable? Had my grief over Robert's death somehow transformed into an unhealthy need to control David's life? "I just want to be part of your life," I'd said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "But not on my terms," he'd replied. "Only on yours. When you want, how you want, as much as you want. And when I try to tell you it's too much, you act like I'm being ungrateful or cruel." I'd looked around the living room, then at the walls I'd helped him afford, the windows I'd helped him choose curtains for, the furniture I'd helped him buy. For the first time, I'd wondered if he saw these things as gifts or as chains, symbols of love or instruments of control. "What do you want me to do?" I'd asked, genuinely confused about how to move forward. "I want you to give me space. Real space. I want you to stop calling every day to check up on me. I want you to stop dropping by unannounced with food and groceries and opinions. I want you to stop offering advice I didn't ask for about my job, my relationships, my spending habits, my health. I want you to let me live my life and make my own mistakes without feeling like you're watching over my shoulder all the time, keeping track of everything I do wrong so you can fix it." "And if I do that?" I'd asked, my heart racing with a fear I couldn't quite name. "What then? We just don't talk? Don't see each other?" "We talk when I'm ready to talk. We see each other when I invite you, or when you ask and I say yes. We have a relationship that works for both of us, not just for you." I'd felt a flash of anger then, sharp and surprising in its intensity. "So I'm supposed to just sit at home and wait for you to decide when you want a mother? You're supposed to live your own life instead of trying to live mine through me." The silence that had followed had been deafening. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel, the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the sound of my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. Everything David had said was circling in my mind, and I couldn't tell which parts were fair criticism and which parts were just cruel. But as I'd sat there, trying to process his words, other memories had started surfacing. The relief I'd felt when David's relationships ended because it meant I didn't have to share his attention. The way I'd discouraged him from taking a job opportunity in another city, because it would have meant seeing him less frequently, the satisfaction I'd gotten from being the person he called first when he had problems. Even as I'd noticed he seemed less and less happy about needing to make those calls. Maybe David was right. Maybe I had been trying to live his life instead of figuring out how to live my own without Robert. "I think," I'd said slowly, standing up from the couch, "that you're forgetting how much I've sacrificed for you over the years." His expression had hardened again. "There it is. The guilt trip. The reminder of all your sacrifices." "They weren't guilt trips, David. They were actual sacrifices. Real money, real time, real love invested in your future. When your father died and you were struggling with debt, who helped you? When you couldn't afford a security deposit for a better apartment, who covered it? When you needed a co-signer for this house, who put their financial security on the line? That I didn't ask for." The words had exploded out of him, and I'd taken a step back from the force of his emotion. "You offered all those things before I could even think about whether I wanted them or not. You didn't ask to be helped with college? You didn't ask for help with a down payment? You didn't ask me to co-sign your mortgage?" "I asked for help, not ownership. I asked for support, not control. There's a difference between helping someone and making them dependent on you." We'd stared at each other across the living room, and I'd realized we'd reached some kind of breaking point. All the love, all the years of shared history, all the memories of him as a little boy who'd needed me for everything. Somehow it had all led us to this moment where we were standing in the home I'd helped him buy, shouting at each other like enemies. "Maybe," I'd said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady, "we both need to think about what kind of relationship we want to have going forward. I've already thought about it. he'd said. I need space, real space. Starting now. How much space? I'd asked, and I'd hated how small my voice sounded. I don't know. Months, maybe. However long it takes for me to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to manage your expectations and your feelings all the time. I'd picked up my purse from the coffee table, leaving the chili and groceries where they were. They suddenly felt like evidence of everything David had accused me of: unwanted gifts that came with strings attached, gestures that served my need to feel needed more than his need to be helped. Fine, I'd said, though nothing about the situation felt fine. You want space? You'll get space. I'd walked toward the front door and he'd followed me, maintaining that same careful distance he'd kept throughout our conversation. At the threshold, I turned back to look at him one more time. My son, my baby, the person I'd loved more than my own life for 32 years, was looking at me like I was a problem that needed to be solved. David, I'd said softly, making one last attempt to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. I hope you understand that everything I've done has been because I love you. He'd been quiet for a long moment, and I thought maybe I'd gotten through to him. Maybe he'd remember all the ways I'd shown my love over the years. But when he'd finally spoken, his voice had been tired rather than angry. I know you love me, Mom, but your love feels like prison sometimes. And then he'd said the words that would replay in my mind for hours afterward, the words that would change everything between us. You can leave now. Not goodbye, not I'll call you when I'm ready, not even drive safely. Just a dismissal that made me feel like an unwelcome visitor in the life I'd helped build, an intruder in the home I'd helped him buy. I'd driven home in a daze, replaying every moment of the conversation. The hurt had been overwhelming at first. How could my own son speak to me that way? How could he dismiss years of love and sacrifice so casually? But as I'd sat in my empty house that evening, the hurt had gradually transformed into something harder and more complex. I'd pulled out old photo albums, looking at pictures of David from birth through adulthood. In every single image, I could see my hand somewhere in the frame steadying him as a toddler, helping him with school projects, standing beside him at graduations and celebrations. When had my presence in his life gone from welcome to burdensome? When had my love started feeling like prison? But as the night had worn on, alongside the hurt and confusion, another emotion had begun to surface: anger. Because while David had been busy accusing me of being controlling and suffocating, he'd been perfectly happy to accept my help when it suited him. The co-signed mortgage that had made his homeownership possible, the furniture I'd bought when he couldn't afford to furnish the place properly, the countless small financial helps over the years that had smoothed his path to independence. If my help had felt like prison, if my involvement had been so unwelcome, why had he kept accepting it? Why had he let me co-sign for a house he apparently didn't want me to have opinions about? Why had he taken my money for repairs and improvements if he didn't want me to care about the property? I'd spent hours that night going through the file folder where I kept copies of all the financial documents related to David's house, the original mortgage application with both our names on it, the insurance policies where I was listed as an interested party, the records of payments I'd made when his account had been short. My name was on every single document, not just as a co-signer, but as someone with legal rights and responsibilities. For 4 years since Robert's death, I'd been carefully managing my finances to ensure I could cover David's mortgage if something went wrong with his job. I'd turned down opportunities to travel, to renovate my own outdated kitchen, to make investments that might have improved my retirement security. All because I'd wanted to make sure his monthly payment was safe, his home ownership secure. I'd been living below my means, saving money I could have spent on myself, all to provide a financial safety net for someone who apparently saw my involvement as an intrusion rather than a gift. And today he'd dismissed me from his life like I was a stranger who'd overstayed her welcome. Sitting at my kitchen table until nearly midnight, staring at those papers and thinking about David's words, I'd felt something shift inside me. He'd wanted space. He'd wanted to live his life without feeling like I was watching over his shoulder. He'd wanted to make his own mistakes without my interference. Fine, he could have exactly what he'd asked for. But if David wanted complete independence from my involvement in his life, then he could have complete independence from my financial support as well. If my help was unwelcome, if my concern was suffocating, if my love felt like prison, then maybe it was time for him to experience what life looked like without any of those things. The next morning, I'd called the bank that held David's mortgage. As a co-signer with legal rights to the loan, I had several options available to me, including the right to remove myself from the obligation under certain circumstances. Mrs. Patterson, the loan officer, had said when I'd explained what I wanted to do, "You understand that if you withdraw from this mortgage arrangement, your son will need to qualify for refinancing on his own income and credit, or will have the right to call in the full amount of the loan." "I understand completely," I'd said, "and you understand that this action will likely force a sale of the property if he can't secure alternative financing within the specified time frame?" "I understand that as well. This is a fairly unusual request. May I ask what's prompting this change?" I'd been quiet for a moment, thinking about how to explain the situation without going into personal details. "My son has requested complete independence from my involvement in his financial affairs. I'm honoring that request." The process had taken most of the morning. Phone calls to verify my identity, paperwork to document my withdrawal from the loan, signatures on forms that would trigger a 30-day notice requiring David to either pay off the mortgage in full or qualify for new financing without my co-signature. I'd known David's financial situation well enough to understand that neither option would be easy for him. His credit was decent but not excellent good enough to qualify for the loan with my backing, but probably not strong enough to refinance the full amount on his own. His income was steady but modest, and the debt-to-income ratio that had been acceptable with my co-signature would likely be problematic for a new lender evaluating him alone. As I'd driven home from the bank that afternoon, I'd felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and anxiety. I'd given David exactly what he'd said he wanted, complete independence from my involvement in his life, but I'd also known that the consequences were going to be severe. And despite everything that had happened between us, the thought of him losing his home had made my chest tight with worry. My phone had started ringing before I'd even reached my driveway. David's name on the screen. I'd let it go to voicemail. The second call had come 10 minutes later. Again, I hadn't answered. The third call had come as I'd been making myself a sandwich for lunch. This time, I'd picked up the phone. "Mom?" His voice had been different, higher, strained, with an edge of panic that I'd rarely heard from him. "I just got a call from the bank. They said something about changes to my mortgage. They said you removed yourself as a co-signer. They said I have 30 days to refinance or they'll call in the full amount of the loan." "Hello, David," I'd said calmly, taking a bite of my sandwich before responding. "How are you today?" "Don't, Mom. Just tell me what's happening." "What did you do?" "I did exactly what you asked me to do," I'd said. "You wanted space from my involvement in your life. You wanted independence from my opinions and my help. So I've given you complete independence." That's not what I meant, and you know it, isn't it? You said my help felt like ownership, like control. You said you wanted to live your life without feeling like I was watching over your shoulder. So I'm removing my oversight entirely." I could hear him breathing heavily on the other end of the line, and I'd imagined him pacing in that same living room where he dismissed me less than 24 hours earlier. "Mom, you can't do this. I can't qualify for a mortgage on my own, you know that. My credit isn't good enough. My income isn't high enough. My debt-to-income ratio won't work without your backing." "Then I suppose you'll need to figure out an alternative solution." "What alternative solution? I'll lose the house." "Maybe you will," I'd said, and I'd been surprised by how calm my voice had sounded. "But it will be your choice, your consequence, your life to manage. Isn't that what you wanted?" "I wanted you to stop showing up uninvited and commenting on every aspect of my personal life. I didn't want you to destroy my entire future." "I haven't destroyed anything, David. I've simply stopped enabling it." There had been a long silence on the phone. When he'd spoken again, his voice had been quieter but no less desperate. "This is revenge." "No," I'd said firmly. "Revenge would be vindictive and emotional. This is consequences. For 32 years, I've made sure you never had to face the real consequences of your choices. You wanted independence? Independence comes with consequences. But I can't afford." "Then maybe you couldn't afford the house to begin with." Another silence. Then, So that's it? You're just going to let me lose everything because I hurt your feelings? I'd felt a flare of anger at the dismissive way he'd characterized our conversation and everything that had led up to it. You didn't hurt my feelings, David. You made it clear that my presence in your life was unwelcome and that my help was unwanted. I'm honoring your request by removing both. By sabotaging my life? By stepping back from your life. There's a difference. I'd heard him starting to cry then, and despite everything that had happened, despite the anger and hurt and disappointment, my heart had clenched with the automatic maternal response to comfort him. Mom, please. I'm sorry I said those things yesterday. I was angry, and I didn't mean— Which things didn't you mean? I'd interrupted. That I was suffocating you? That my love felt like prison? That I was trying to live your life instead of my own? Which parts were just anger, and which parts were true? He'd been quiet for so long I'd thought he might have hung up. Finally, some of it was true, but not enough to deserve this. David, I'd said gently, do you remember what you said to me yesterday as I was leaving your house? I don't. You told me I could leave. Not goodbye. Not thank you for the chili I'd brought, not I love you despite our argument. You told me I could leave like I was some unwelcome stranger in the house I helped you buy. I was angry. So was I. The difference is, when I got angry, I didn't dismiss you. I didn't treat you like you were nothing. I could hear him sobbing now, and every maternal instinct I had was screaming at me to comfort him. To tell him everything would be okay, to fix this problem like I'd fixed so many others over the years. But I'd forced myself to stay quiet, to let him feel the full weight of the situation he'd created. What do you want from me? He'd asked finally. I don't want anything from you, I'd said. That's the point. For the first time in your adult life, this isn't about what I want or what I think you should do. It's about what you choose to do with the independence you demanded. I don't know how to fix this. Then you'll figure it out, or you won't. But either way, it will be your choice to make. Will you, if I ask for help, will you help me figure out options? I'd considered the question carefully, thinking about the difference between the kind of help I'd been offering for years and the kind of support that might actually be helpful. Are you asking me to help, or are you asking me to fix it? I don't know the difference anymore. Help is when I give you information and support while you make the decisions. Fix is when I take over and solve the problem for you. Which one do you want? Help, he'd said quietly. I want help. Then start by apologizing for the way you treated me yesterday. Not because you need something from me now, but because you recognize that what you did was hurtful and wrong. Another long pause. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for dismissing you and for making you feel unwelcome in my life and for treating you like you didn't matter. I'm sorry for taking your help for granted and then complaining about it when it came with expectations I didn't want to meet. Thank you, I'd said. And I'm sorry for using my financial help as a way to maintain control over your life. You were right about that part. So what happens now? I'd looked out my kitchen window at the garden I'd been neglecting, the life I'd been putting on hold while I'd focused all my energy on managing David's problems and decisions. Now you have 30 days to figure out your housing situation. I'll help you research options and talk through possibilities, but the decisions have to be yours. And the consequences, good or bad, have to be yours too. And us? Our relationship? That depends on whether you really want a relationship with me or whether you just want a safety net. Over the following days, David and I had more honest conversations than we'd had in years. Without the automatic buffer of my problem solving, he'd been forced to think through his options himself, and I'd had to resist the urge to take over and manage the situation for him. He'd explored refinancing options first, applying to 3 different lenders to see if anyone would approve a new loan based on his income and credit alone. The first rejection had come back within days. His debt-to-income ratio was too high without my assets backing the application. The second lender had been willing to consider a smaller loan amount, but it would have required him to bring a significant amount of cash to closing to pay down the existing balance. The third had required a co-signer, which brought us back to square one. What about roommates? I'd suggested during one of our phone calls. If you could split the mortgage payment with someone reliable, that might make your debt-to-income ratio more manageable to lenders. It wasn't a solution I would have recommended before our fight. I would have been too worried about him living with strangers, too concerned about his privacy and comfort. But now I was focused on practical solutions rather than my own anxiety about his choices. I hadn't thought about that, he'd admitted. It would completely change how I live in the house, though. Yes, it would. But you'd still have the house. And you'd be okay with that? With me renting out rooms in the place you helped me buy? David, it's not my house. It's your house and your choice. He'd been quiet for a moment. It doesn't feel like my house anymore. It feels like this symbol of, I don't know, all the ways I've been dependent on you. What do you want it to feel like? Like home. Like a place that's mine because I earned it, not because you made it possible. Then maybe, I'd said carefully, you need to find a place you can afford on your own. The conversation that had followed was different from any we'd had before. Instead of me presenting solutions and him reacting to them, we'd talked through the real numbers, what he could afford on his income alone, what kind of life he wanted to live, what compromises he was willing to make for the sake of independence. His current mortgage payment, even split with roommates, would still be a stretch. But there were condos and smaller houses in different neighborhoods that would fit his budget. The down payment from selling his current house would be enough to buy something modest outright, eliminating monthly mortgage payments entirely. I keep thinking I should be devastated about this, he'd said during one of our longer conversations. Losing the house, starting over, admitting that I can't afford the life I've been living. But I'm not devastated. I'm actually relieved? Why do you think that is? Because it would be mine, he'd said. The smaller place, the more modest life, it would all be mine. Even if I mess it up, it'll be my mess to deal with. I'd understood exactly what he meant, though it had taken me longer to reach the same realization. And I keep thinking, he'd continued, about what you said, about the difference between help and fix. I think I've been asking you to fix my life for so long that I forgot how to live it. I think I forgot how to let you live it. The decision to sell the house hadn't been made in a moment of panic or desperation. David had taken 2 weeks to research his options, to visit properties in his price range, to talk with a financial advisor about the long-term implications of different choices. When he'd finally called to tell me his decision, his voice had been calm and certain. I'm going to sell, he'd said. I found a buyer who's willing to pay enough to cover the mortgage and leave me with about $40,000 for a down payment on something smaller. How do you feel about that choice? Scared, he'd admitted, but also excited. I found a condo about 20 minutes from my office. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, small but well-maintained. I can buy it outright with the proceeds from this sale. No mortgage at all? No mortgage, no co-signers, no monthly payments except maintenance fees and taxes. It'll be completely mine. The relief in his voice had been unmistakable, and I'd realized that the house I'd thought was helping him build a foundation had actually been a burden he'd been carrying to please me. Moving day had been emotional in ways I hadn't expected. I'd arrived to help pack, and we'd worked mostly in comfortable silence, wrapping dishes and folding clothes. It had felt different from all the times I'd helped him before, less frantic, less like I was managing his life for him. You know what's strange? He'd said as we'd loaded boxes into the moving truck. I keep waiting to feel sad about leaving this place, but I don't. I feel like I'm finally going towards something instead of away from something. What do you think you're going toward? I don't know yet, but for the first time in years, I get to find out without feeling like I'm disappointing you if I choose wrong. The condo had been a revelation, small, yes, but bright and modern, with hardwood floors and large windows that let in more light than his old house ever had. As I'd watched him direct the movers and arrange his furniture in the new space, I'd seen something in his face that had been missing for years: genuine ownership. Not just legal ownership, but emotional ownership, the satisfaction of being in a space he'd chosen and could afford entirely on his own. It's perfect, I'd told him as we'd stood in his new living room, surveying the space. It's tiny, he'd said, but he'd been smiling. It's yours. We'd ordered pizza for dinner and eaten sitting on his couch, surrounded by boxes that he would unpack at his own pace, in his own way. For the first time in years, I hadn't been mentally making a list of things I could do to help him settle in. I'd just been sitting with my son, enjoying his company without an agenda. Mom, he'd said as I'd been getting ready to leave, I need to tell you something. Okay, I've been seeing someone. A woman named Jennifer. I've been seeing her for about 3 months now. I'd felt that familiar pang, part curiosity, part protective instinct, part fear of being displaced in his affections. But instead of asking questions or offering opinions, I just waited for him to continue. I didn't tell you about her before because ... He'd paused, looking embarrassed. Because I was afraid you'd interfere. After what happened with Sarah, I didn't want to risk having you drive away someone I really care about. The words had stung, but I'd understood them. How do you feel about her? I think I love her, he'd said simply, and I think she might love me back. That's wonderful, David. She doesn't know about ... this. About the house, about our fight, about why I'm moving. I told her I wanted something smaller and more manageable, which is true. But I didn't tell her about the mortgage situation. Why not? Because I was embarrassed. Because I didn't want her to think I was financially irresponsible or that my family was dysfunctional. I'd considered this carefully. What do you think would happen if you told her the truth? I don't know. Maybe she'd think I was immature for letting the situation get so complicated. Maybe she'd be concerned about my relationship with you. Or maybe she'd understand that families are complicated and that growing up sometimes requires making difficult changes. He'd looked at me with surprise. You think I should tell her? I think honest relationships require honest communication. But that's your choice to make. Would you like to meet her sometime when we're both ready for that? The old me would have said yes immediately, would have started planning dinner invitations and holiday gatherings. The new me had taken a breath and considered what he was really asking. When you're ready to introduce us, I'd said, I'd be honored to meet her. He'd smiled then, a real smile, not the careful, guarded ones I'd been getting for months. Thank you. For what? For letting me figure this out. For not trying to fix it. For being my mom without trying to be my manager. The months that followed had been a period of adjustment for both of us. David had settled into his new condo and his new level of financial independence with a confidence I hadn't seen in him since he was a teenager. He'd started taking on freelance marketing projects in addition to his regular job, building both his skills and his savings account. He joined a gym near his new place, started cooking more regularly, even adopted a rescue dog, a small, energetic terrier named Charlie, who seemed to bring out a playful side of David I'd almost forgotten existed. Our relationship had developed a new rhythm during this time. Instead of daily check-in calls, we talked twice a week, usually on Wednesday evenings and Sunday afternoons. Instead of unannounced visits, we made plans in advance, and sometimes he came to my house instead of me always going to his. The conversations were different too, less focused on problems that needed solving and more on experiences we wanted to share. I'd used the time to examine my own life in ways I'd been avoiding since Robert's death. I'd started volunteering at the local library, helping seniors learn to use computers and tablets. I joined a book club, taken a pottery class, even started dating, something I told myself I wasn't ready for, but had actually just been too busy managing David's life to consider. His name was Frank, a gentle widower I'd met at the book club. He was patient with my rusty dating skills and understanding about my complicated relationship with my son. When I told him about the mortgage situation, he hadn't judged either David or me, had simply listened and offered the perspective of someone who'd raised 3 independent children of his own. The hardest part of parenting, he'd said over coffee one afternoon, is learning when to step back. But it sounds like you figured it out just in time. 4 months after David had moved into his condo, he'd called to invite me to dinner. When I'd arrived, Jennifer had been there, a warm, intelligent woman with an easy laugh and a genuine interest in getting to know me. She'd clearly been nervous about the meeting, but as the evening had progressed, I'd seen her relax into the conversation. David told me about your situation with the house, she'd said as we'd all worked together to clean up after dinner. That must have been a really difficult decision for both of you. It was, I'd admitted, but it was also necessary. He's different now, she'd said quietly, glancing toward the living room where David was throwing a ball for Charlie. More confident, more ... settled in himself. I don't know what he was like before, but I can see that he's happy with who he is now. Watching David and Jennifer together, I'd seen something I'd rarely witnessed in his previous relationships: ease. They moved around each other naturally, shared jokes I wasn't part of. had clearly developed the kind of comfortable intimacy that comes from spending real time together without outside interference. "How long have you two been together?" I'd asked. "6 months," Jennifer had said. "We met at a dog park. Charlie had decided that my golden retriever, Bella, was his new best friend." "And you didn't mind that David came with a mortgage-free but pet-owning lifestyle?" She'd laughed. "I thought it was refreshing, actually. Most guys my age are either still living like college students or they're so house-poor they can't afford to do anything fun. David has his priorities figured out." Later that evening, as Jennifer had been getting ready to leave, she'd pulled me aside in the kitchen. "I wanted to thank you," she'd said quietly. "For what?" "For raising someone who knows how to be a partner instead of a project. David doesn't need me to take care of him or fix his life, and I don't need to compete with his mother for his attention. That's pretty rare." Her words had stayed with me as I'd driven home that night. For so many years, I'd worried that David's relationships would take him away from me, that loving someone else would mean loving me less. But watching him with Jennifer, I'd realized that his independence had actually made more room for me in his life, not less, because he was choosing to include me rather than feeling obligated to manage my expectations. 6 months later, David had called with news I'd been both expecting and hoping for. "Jennifer and I are engaged," he'd said, and I could hear the joy in his voice. "I proposed last weekend during a camping trip." She said yes. "David, that's wonderful news. I'm so happy for both of you. We want to have a small wedding, probably in the spring, and we were hoping, would you help us plan it?" The request had caught me off guard. "You want my help?" "We want your input and your ideas, yes. But Jennifer's pretty clear about what she wants, and I know what I want too. We're not asking you to plan our wedding for us. We're asking you to be part of planning it with us." The distinction had been subtle but important, and I'd felt a surge of gratitude for how carefully he'd phrased the invitation. "I would love to help you plan your wedding." The wedding planning process had been a joy in ways I hadn't expected. Jennifer had been decisive about the big things: venue, dress style, general aesthetic, but open to suggestions about details. David had been actively involved in every decision, from the music selection to the menu choices, and I'd been able to contribute ideas and assistance without feeling like I was taking over or being taken for granted. The wedding itself had been beautiful, a small ceremony in a local botanical garden, followed by dinner at a restaurant that specialized in farm-to-table cuisine. As I'd watched David and Jennifer exchange vows they'd written themselves, I'd felt a peace I hadn't experienced in years. During his speech at the reception, David had surprised me by addressing our journey directly. "A year ago," he'd said, looking at me across the room, "my mom and I went through a really difficult time in our relationship. We had to learn how to love each other in a healthier way, how to support each other without trying to control each other. It wasn't easy, and it required both of us to make some pretty scary changes." He'd paused, and I'd felt the attention of the small group focused on us both. "But going through that process taught me something important about what kind of husband I wanted to be," he'd continued. "I wanted to be someone who could love Jennifer without needing her to complete me. Someone who could support her dreams without trying to direct them. Someone who could be a partner instead of a project." He'd raised his glass then. "So thank you, Mom, for teaching me the difference between love and possession. And thank you, Jennifer, for loving someone who's still figuring out how to be a grown-up." Later that evening, as the reception had been winding down, David had found me cleaning up centerpieces and directed me to sit down. "I need to tell you something," he'd said, settling into the chair next to mine. "Okay. I've been thinking a lot lately about what happened with the mortgage, about our fight, about everything that followed. I'd felt a twist of anxiety, worried that he might still harbor resentment about how everything had unfolded. And I realized something," he'd continued. "You did the right thing." "What do you mean?" "Canceling the mortgage, making me figure things out on my own. It was the right thing to do. At the time, it felt like punishment, like you were trying to hurt me. But you weren't. You were trying to help me grow up." "I wasn't sure about that myself at the time," I'd admitted. "I was angry and hurt, and part of me did want you to understand what it felt like to be dismissed. But mostly you wanted me to learn how to take care of myself. Mostly I wanted us to have a relationship that was based on choice instead of obligation." He'd nodded. "Jennifer and I have talked about this a lot. About boundaries, about family dynamics, about how to be independent while still being connected. She says that what you did stepping back when I needed space was one of the most loving things a parent can do. How does she know? Because her parents never learned how to do it. They still try to run her life, still make her feel guilty for making choices they don't approve of. She says being with me has shown her what it looks like when someone loves you enough to let you be yourself. As I'd driven home that night, still wearing my mother of the groom dress and feeling lighter than I had in years, I'd thought about the journey that had brought us to this point. It had started with a moment of rejection so painful I'd responded by pulling away completely. But that painful moment had been necessary. It had forced both of us to examine a relationship that had become unhealthy for both of us. The mortgage cancellation that had seemed so drastic at the time now felt like exactly what we'd both needed. A clean break from a dynamic that wasn't serving either of us. A forced reset that had allowed us to rebuild our relationship on better terms. 2 years later, David and Jennifer had their first child, a daughter they named Grace. When David had called to tell me about the birth, his voice thick with emotion and exhaustion, I'd felt the familiar surge of maternal instinct to rush over and help. But I'd also felt something new, confidence that he and Jennifer would figure out how to be parents in their own way, without needing me to manage the process for them. "Can I come meet her?" I'd asked. "We were hoping you'd want to," he'd said. "But maybe tomorrow? We're pretty overwhelmed today, and Jennifer's still recovering." "Of course. I'll call tomorrow and see when might be a good time." When I'd finally met my granddaughter 2 days later, holding her tiny form in the rocking chair in David and Jennifer's nursery, I'd felt a love so pure and intense it had taken my breath away. But alongside that love was a determination to be a different kind of grandmother than I had been, a mother present but not intrusive, helpful but not controlling, loving but not possessive. "She's perfect," I'd whispered, watching Grace's tiny fingers curl around mine. "She is," David had agreed, settling into the chair next to mine. "And terrifying. I have no idea what I'm doing." "Nobody does," I'd said. "You figure it out as you go." "Will you help us figure it out?" "When you ask me to," I'd said. "But you and Jennifer get to decide what kind of parents you want to be." As Grace had grown from infant to toddler, I'd watched David and Jennifer navigate the challenges of new parenthood with a competence and partnership that filled me with pride. They'd asked for my advice occasionally, had accepted offers of babysitting gratefully, but had never made me feel like I was responsible for solving their problems or managing their decisions. And Grace had become the light of my life in ways that felt healthy and joyful rather than anxious and controlling. I saw her once or twice a week, took her on outings that David and Jennifer planned in advance, spoiled her in the ways grandparents are supposed to spoil grandchildren, with books and art supplies and special adventures rather than with undermining her parents' authority. Looking back now, 5 years after that awful conversation in David's living room, I can see how necessary that breaking point had been. We'd both been trapped in a dynamic that was preventing either of us from growing, from becoming the people we were meant to be. David had needed to learn that love wasn't about being taken care of, that independence wasn't just about rejecting help, but about taking responsibility for consequences. And I had needed to learn that love wasn't about being needed, that the greatest gift I could give my son was the confidence to live his own life and the freedom to choose me as part of it. The mortgage cancellation had been the catalyst for all of this growth, but it hadn't been the solution itself. The real work had come in the months and years that followed, as we'd both learned new ways of relating to each other, new ways of loving that left room for both connection and independence. These days, my relationship with David feels like what I'd always hoped it could be: warm, genuine, chosen rather than obligated. We talk regularly but not compulsively. We see each other frequently but not frantically. We're part of each other's lives without trying to run each other's lives. And when I look at Grace, now a precocious 5-year-old with David's eyes and Jennifer's laugh, I see the possibility of a relationship that starts healthy and stays that way, one where love is expressed through support rather than control, where boundaries are respected rather than resented, where independence is celebrated rather than feared. If you've ever found yourself in a relationship where your love feels like a burden to someone else, where your help is resented rather than appreciated, I want you to know that sometimes the kindest thing you can do is step back, not as punishment, but as an invitation for both of you to figure out who you are when you're not trying to manage each other's lives. It's terrifying to let go of someone you love, to stop fixing their problems and smoothing their path. The temptation to intervene, to help, to prevent them from making mistakes can feel overwhelming. But on the other side of that fear is the possibility of a relationship built on choice, respect, and genuine appreciation for each other as separate, capable people. My son and I found our way back to each other, but it required both of us to be willing to lose what we had in order to build something better. It required me to stop being afraid of his independence and him to stop being afraid of my expectations. It required both of us to learn the difference between love and control, between help and enabling, between being needed and being wanted. The day I canceled David's mortgage, I thought I was teaching him a lesson about gratitude and consequences. What I actually did was give both of us permission to grow up him into the kind of man who could be a true partner and father, and me into the kind of woman who could be proud of raising someone capable of living his own life. That mortgage was just paperwork and monthly payments. But what we built in its aftermath was something much more valuable, a real, honest, chosen connection between two people who had finally learned the difference between love and possession, between support and control, between being family by obligation and being family by choice. And that lesson that love is not about making yourself indispensable, but about helping someone become so whole and confident that they choose to include you, has become the foundation for every relationship in my life since then. With Frank, who I married 2 years ago in a simple ceremony with David and Jennifer as our witnesses. With Grace, who calls me Grandma Maggie and trusts me to take her on adventures because she knows I'll always bring her safely home to her parents. Even with Jennifer's parents, who have slowly learned to follow our example of loving involvement without overwhelming interference. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to withdraw your help, to refuse to enable someone's dependence on you, to force both of you to discover who you are when you're not trying to manage each other's emotions and choices. Sometimes you have to be willing to lose the relationship you have in order to create space for the relationship you both actually want. It's not easy, and it's not painless. There were nights during those first few months when I wondered if I'd damaged our relationship permanently, if my pride and hurt feelings had cost me my son forever. But love that's real, love that's healthy, love that's meant to last, that kind of love can survive the growing pains of learning how to do it better. My son told me to leave, so I left. But in the space that departure created, we both learned how to come back to each other as equals, as adults, as people who chose to love each other not because we had to, but because we wanted to. And that choice, made freely and joyfully every day since then, has been worth every difficult conversation, every sleepless night, every moment of uncertainty we endured to get there.